All right. Today, we're going to dive into what is easily one of the most controversial books of the 20th century. I'm talking about Friedrich A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And, using an analysis by the economist Thomas Sowell as our guide, we're going to unpack its central and, frankly, pretty terrifying warning. It all really kicks off with one simple question.
So, can good intentions actually pave the road to tyranny? The whole argument really hinges on this one provocative question. And I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, right? Counterintuitive for sure. How can trying to do good, trying to make the world a better place, possibly lead to something awful? Well, that's the dangerous paradox that Hayek was trying to warn everyone about almost 80 years ago now.
Okay, so to really get why Hayek's book was such a bombshell, you have to kind of step back and look at the world it was born into. We're talking about the early 20th century, and it was an era that was just completely in love with the idea of big, grand, centrally planned societies. Collectivism. It wasn't some fringe concept. For a lot of people, it was the future.
So what Hayek saw, and what we're looking at here, is this incredible range of movements that were all fundamentally pushing in the same direction. I mean, you've got fascism in Italy, communism in the Soviet Union, and then Nazism in Germany, and even the New Deal over in the US. Hayek's whole point was that the common thread, the DNA they all shared, was this core belief in giving the state more and more power to organize society. And by World War II, man, this idea was at its absolute peak. Individual goals were just put on the back burner for national survival, everywhere. And this political mood, it was totally mirrored in the world of economics. The big name on campus, the dominant figure, was John Maynard Keynes. His whole thing was that governments should be actively managing their economies. But pushing back against this huge intellectual tide was a much, much smaller group of thinkers, Hayek included. They were still arguing for free markets, for the individual being the main player. And at the time, honestly, most people saw them as dinosaurs, relics from a past age.
So it's into that environment that Friedrich Hayek launches what you could basically call an intellectual grenade. See, he wasn't just politely suggesting a different economic policy. No, he was standing up and shouting that the entire direction the whole world was heading in was fundamentally incredibly dangerous. And here it is, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944. Thomas Sowell points out that it is really hard to imagine a more unpromising time for a book like this to come out. Think about it. It was released right at the height of World War II, a time when massive government planning wasn't just some popular idea. It was seen as absolutely essential to win the war.
Now, let's talk about that title, because serfdom can be a little misleading. When Hayek uses that word, he isn't talking about, medieval peasants tied to a lord's land. Not at all. He's talking about something very modern, that slow, steady, creeping loss of your individual choice, your personal freedom, as more and more power gets handed over to a central government. And it's all done in the name of the greater good.
Okay, so this is the absolute heart of his argument. Hayek said, look, despite all their different names and different stated goals, systems like fascism, Nazism, and even socialism, they're all built on the exact same engine, central economic planning. He argued that the moment you try to direct a whole society from the top down, you have to, inevitably, start crushing individual liberty just to make the plan work. And here was the really shocking part for people at the time. He warned that even the most well-intentioned democratic socialism was basically just the first step onto that very same road.
So, yeah, as you can probably imagine, this idea did not go over well. The reaction was instant, it was intense, and it was completely divided depending on where you happen to be in the world. And just to give you a little taste of how toxic this idea was considered in the United States, 3 different American publishers flat out rejected the book. The intellectual climate was just so hostile to his message that they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
And when it finally did get published in the US, the reaction was, Thomas Sowell describes it as passionate hatred. It was seen as a direct, malicious attack on the progressive ideals of the day, especially something like President Roosevelt's New Deal, which of course had massively expanded the government's role in American life.
But then you hop across the Atlantic to Britain, and it's a totally different story. Over there, the book was received in a much more thoughtful and receptive manner. And that stark difference in how people reacted really shows you how Hayek's warning was being filtered through the totally unique political glasses of each country.
So for decades, Hayek's book pretty much just sat there on the intellectual fringe. It was an outsider idea. But then, as the 20th century started to wind down, history took a pretty sharp turn. And all of a sudden, this unpopular warning, it didn't just seem relevant anymore, it started to look kind of prophetic.
You see, what happened was the economic problems in all those centrally planned countries started to become impossible to ignore, and especially after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, what Thomas Sowell calls the collectivist tide just started to pull back. People began looking around for different answers, for alternative ideas, and in that search, a whole lot of them rediscovered Hayek's work.
And this is where you really see the book's incredible long-term impact. I mean, Hayek's ideas became a foundational piece for a whole new generation of world leaders. We're talking about people like Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. They actively used his work as a blueprint to try and reverse that trend of government expansion. So an idea that was once totally rejected was now right at the very center of power. It's an amazing turnaround.
But honestly, the most chilling part of Hayek's warning, it isn't really just about economics. It goes deeper. It's about psychology. It's about power. It's about how the very people with the absolute best intentions, the idealists, can end up, completely by accident, creating the perfect conditions for the worst kinds of people to take over. Hayek laid out this tragic, step-by-step process. It starts like this. Step 1, idealists come along and demand these really noble goals, things like real equality for everyone. Okay, step 2, to achieve these amazing goals, the state is given a huge amount of power. Then, step 3, in the big rush to do all this good, things like individual rights and the rule of law, they start to look like obstacles, so they get brushed aside for the greater good. And here's the final, terrible trap. The kind of person who is willing and able to wield that kind of immense, unchecked power, it's not the idealist who started the whole thing. It's the most ruthless person in the room. And this quote from Hayek himself just captures that terrifying irony perfectly. He says the idealists, they create these systems that they truly believe will make a better world. But in doing that, they accidentally create a power vacuum that can only be filled by the people who crave power for its own sake. It's like the good intentions pave the road, but a totally different kind of person ends up behind the wheel.
And so, that leaves us right back where we started, with the core dilemma that Hayek's work forces us all to think about. It's a question that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1944. How do we, as a society, chase progress? How do we try to make things better without sacrificing our liberty along the way? That right there is the enduring warning of the road to serfdom.